maybe we can ask something maybe which touches on something which Zenzile also mentioned regarding, because he talked about how he's able to get up within the church and he has the privilege of being listened to and to be unquestioned in terms of his gender. Maybe people might question whether he's qualified in terms of what you've studied or whatever, but no one is going to be questioning his capacity to stand up front there because of his gender. What do you make of the notion of male privilege and the different manifestations, I guess, that it can take within church spaces and in other spaces as well? Well, I guess it has to be asked, because I think sometimes you can't take these things for granted. Do you believe male privilege exists? And if it does, what are some of the manifestations of it, and how can we dismantle it?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it really does exist. I feel like we're faced with such a mountain-sized problem, because the funny thing about the church is that there's more women in the church than men, but yet the whole privilege thing seems to be, or it just seems to be dominating, and just our mindsets in terms of like letting women in is just like such a difficult and a bizarre thing, which is very confusing, and I don't understand why. It's just simply partnering with people and making sure that we all serving the Lord, you know. So I think it does exist. I think it's something though that that's being handled over time. I mean, I know it depends on which area you come from or which church you actually come from. But I feel though that there is progress that the church is making in terms of bringing up and positioning women into church leadership positions, you know, and positions that we specifically thought that were made for men, you know. I think there is a little bit of improvement being done around that, but is there male privilege? It's definitely there. I strongly believe that it's there, but it's something that I feel the church, right, is moving back, or it's being called to go back to being led by God, you know. It's sort of like what happened back in the Old Testament when the Israelites were requesting to be led by a king rather than God, you know. And God is like, okay, guys, but if you go for this route, there's going to be certain things that are going to be uncomfortable for you guys, you know. So I feel as though such things exist because we have taken God out of the leadership of the church. We've taken God out of our strategy, our planning sessions. You get what I mean? Our DNA, you know. Because when God is there, then we'll begin to realize, you know, it's like the word says, it's a mirror. When we look at the church and how it currently is, who holds the positions, who has more of a voice, you know, we ought to feel in our hearts and in our spirits and be convicted that God is actually saying, you know what, guys, there needs to be a change here. So I feel it is there, but it's being addressed due to the fact that we're drawing closer to God, and we kind of like low-key entering into that season, you know, depending which church you're from, that season where we are relying on the church being led by the Spirit, you know, because all these things, I feel they can easily be changed if we just led by the Spirit, you know.
And heed the Spirit's voice. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, if I can jump in, from my perspective, yeah, definitely, I would say that it definitely does exist within church spaces, but also within broader society as well. As I'm thinking about just the burdens, I guess, that as men or as a man that I don't necessarily have to carry, including certain titles, I guess, that can end up being usually loaded on women that don't necessarily exist for men. So, I mean, in my language, for example, we have a word for a woman who has a child out of wedlock, but we don't have a similar, like, a name for the man who made her pregnant out of wedlock. There's no name for that, but there's a name for the woman. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was telling me about this idea of uyemzini, that whole notion of the one who leaves the marriage, and the notion that even the woman who is abandoned by her husband, she's called uyemzini. But then the husband there's no equivalent word for the husband who is left. It's like, so there's elements there of like, there's certain things that as men, the mistakes that we make don't necessarily, society doesn't necessarily hold us accountable for some of those mistakes that we make, and there are no labels that are given to us for some of those things. Whereas we've got lots of labels that apply to women who make exactly the same sort of like a mistake or a cultural faux pas or whatever, but we don't have any equivalent names whatsoever for men. And I think in one sense, that's one of those things which allow for the culture of impunity, because there really is no accountability. And of course, we slap each other on the back and say, if you're a promiscuous man, you're the man. But somehow, if you're a promiscuous woman, there's names for you, and it's not celebrated. Whereas for men, oftentimes it does get celebrated, wrongly so. So I mean, those are at least some of the few examples I can think of where, as men, we simply just don't carry certain burdens with us. We don't carry certain names with us, and that allows us, I think, to go through life in some ways with a measure of ease that women unfortunately just simply don't have. I don't know, Sbu, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there when it comes to the issue of social labeling, in the sense that when there are a bit of issues that appear in the church, there's labels that come for women that men don't have. I was having a conversation with my sister the other day. I was like, I find it quite interesting that when there's issues of there's issues of church discipline concerning sexual immorality in the church, the woman has to stand up and come before the church to confess in most denominations, and you often don't find the man also coming to do the same thing. Or if there's a word called baukaula in my language, so meaning to what's the English equivalence for the word? More of to cut you off from the church.
Or to like excommunicate you.
Yes, excommunicate. There we go. So to excommunicate, you often find women being excommunicated rather than men actually being put in a position to be excommunicated. But what I mean is that male privilege is there. The mere fact that I don't know what it feels like to walk through the alley and fear for my life, to get into a taxi and fear for my life, to walk into an elevator and fear for my life. You understand what I mean? So the issue, and that's just in society in itself. What more within church? In the sense that, as you say, if I ascend the podium, I don't have to qualify myself before I'm heard. You understand what I mean? By virtue of being a man, I'm already given an ear. But women often have to come with certain credentials or social statuses, before we can be like, let me hear. And so I think those are the kind of issues that, I remember, and I think much of the change that has to happen in our time is that such steps of reformation or change has to be intentional. They just don't happen. It has to be intentional in how you approach, how you decolonize male privilege, with how you approach leadership structures, with how you approach conferences and the speakers that you choose, with how when you have, obviously this is a bit of a different platform, but when you also have different kinds of conversations going on in the church, are you keen to hear what women have to say? So those kind of things show that often we've actually protected male privilege than actually deal with it.
Sure. That's so true. True. Yeah, Mflebo, please go for it.
Yeah, if I can just add, man. I think that the difficult part for me is that unlike I think we all come from the charismatic Christianity, right? Right?
More reformed, but yeah.
More reformed. Okay,
I've been everywhere.
Everywhere. So the one thing for me that I've always had a heart for is if we could unite as a church. The church is not as united as we think it is. For instance, I've always looked at the Universal Church or the Catholic Church and how they can just set up a meeting and they decide that, okay, this is the direction, and that actually becomes the direction. And that's why I said when I was responding that you can come from a different church and they can be handling it in this church, but in this church they're not handling it. I think the struggle is always in that, in the sense that in my church it might be getting addressed. You get what I mean? So I'm a little bit more calmer about it, and my perspective is just totally different. But when you look at like the broader side of things, it's actually might not be addressed. But if we had a unified body, I feel like there's a lot of things that we would be able to quickly and be able to address that if previously affected women.
So how do you thinking about male privilege and how we as men access certain spaces and how we stand in them and all of that. How do you, or perhaps the men that you know, feel or react when relating to a woman who has power, one who has her own mind, who feels free to express it without deferring, I guess, to maleness or to male, that sort of a thing. Is it a feeling of intimidation, feeling of this is absolutely fine, this is okay and normal and natural? So just some reflection, I guess, for yourself or for the people that you know, like how they relate to women that are in positions of power, women that feel very, very free to just express themselves and don't defer to maleness.
Okay. Oh, all right. No, there's an example of a gentleman. Okay. From my end, I think the more I dig into the scriptures, I've seen that as we say, there are good examples of patriarchy, and also there are bad examples of patriarchy. And one of the things that I've seen is that God's intention, actually, from the very beginning, was that men and women would collectively implement God's mandate for themselves. And so when it comes to the issue of domineering, before the fall, God's intention is that their dominance would be over creation rather than over one another. So, and when you look at how the triune nature of God interacts, you see how in their distinct personalities, they still have a space of interaction, but yet of willful submission to one another. And why am I mentioning that? Is that I think the more we detach ourselves from systems of toxic patriarchy, and we more focus on the spirit of servanthood and humility as reflected in the scriptures, I think the more you begin to appreciate that the same spirit that is within me is the same spirit that is within you. And if I can trust that God is wise enough, if I can trust that God is gracious enough to speak through me, I can also trust that God is also gracious enough to speak through you. And so I think much of the time I've realized that it takes time to actually deconscientize your mind from, everybody would like a woman that is independent, is able to reason, and is able to express herself. But until she begins to challenge the status quo within you, until she begins to challenge the cultural bias or misconceptions that you have, that's when you're like, okay, go back in your own corner now. And I think that is where actually the change begins to happen, where we step on each other's egos and we fall back on the nature and the character of Christ to be able to heal us from our brokenness and actually allow this collective space of reflection to shape us. When I hear you put actually, so now the issue that wins is no longer the gender or masculinity or femininity, but the voice of wisdom in which is actually captured in that moment. So we more listen to wisdom rather than we listen to gender. And I think the more we begin to serve one another out of reverence for Christ, then we begin to come out of who said it rather than what, then we start to look at what is being said. Yes. Oh, all right. Actually,
yeah. No. Yeah, and I wish I could say that most of my acquaintances would heed that wisdom, but unfortunately, I think sometimes you do find that people are again, like you're saying, people are happy for a woman who's self-confident and is very able to express herself, whatever. Like stay over there, type of a thing. Like admire you from afar, type thing. But as soon as they come into their own ambit, it's like it gets a little bit that I guess that word intimidating or uncomfortable. Because again, if, people are willing to call you out for your nonsense or for the ways in which, again, sometimes very, very unconsciously just inhabit and express that sense of dominance, or that sense of, oh, I need to be listened to simply because I'm a guy, type of a thing. But when you come across somebody who calls that out, it's uncomfortable. But that is in many ways as it should be. Like you're saying from the very beginning, there was always meant to be this idea of complementarity of man and woman together reflecting the image of God. As opposed to, and of course, that exactly, you put it very, very well, that idea of dominance only came as a result of the fall. That's when Adam named his wife and called her da 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 da, of which you remember the whole naming thing was something that he was, that they were given, but to name the animals, not necessarily to name one another. So that naming of the wife happens after the fall. So I mean, there's something to be learned there in terms of how men and women relate to one another, and how sometimes, we simply just don't, we're not necessarily living into the new creation way of relating to one another as human beings, and taking seriously those scriptures that talk about there being no male, female, Jew, Gentile, and so on and so forth. And like, what does that seriously mean on the day to day, and what does it mean within our church spaces as well? And so I'd love to say that a lot of people understand that and they get that. But I think in many spaces that I've been in, unfortunately, there's way too much of an inclination towards silencing people who get loud, quote unquote, and who stand their ground. Well, I don't know what your experience is.
No, so I'll share from my personal experience, and then from just the men that I've been around, and then what I've then chosen now, because I feel there's three parts to this question: what you were exposed to as you were growing up, and then the cycles or the circles that you got involved in, and then the question would maybe be, did you then keep that keep within those circles, or did you separate due to the fact that you don't really connect to this mindset? So I think it's very important that I link this back to what I said, is that I grew up being raised by my sister, who kind of like was in a marriage where my brother-in-law enabled her to flourish. There was never, she was kind of like more dominant, if I can say that. And taking that, it's always been something to me to always see women and men having free will to be able to become your best version, And whenever you begin to try and suppress somebody because you want to be more dominant, that's like saying they can't be their best version because you must be your best version, I sincerely believe that it is possible, just like Sister said, for us to co-rule or for us to co-dominate, without us dominating each other. But I think the one thing that challenges us as men these days is there's this culture that's just out there. It's like revenge culture. I don't know if it's called revenge culture or what it's called, but like there's this celebration that happens when a man has been hurt in society, that yes, she has represented us in the sense that she's gotten back for all the hurt or all the mistreatment that we've received from men, So just to link that then to this is that I feel as though the men that I used to be surrounded by fear that if they kind of like let a woman lead, if I can call it that, it would result in a situation where, first of all, we are going to laugh at him as men, right? And say, how can you just let a woman lead? And then secondly, when then he thinks about what's currently happening, he's like, but then if I let this woman who's so free, who's such a go-getter, who's such a pioneer, so close into my life, what if she ends up making an example out of me? You get what I mean? Because it seems like there's that whole, are you going to make an example? Are you going to be the justification that we need? Yeah. So, and then for me personally, I'm certainly not intimidated. I love developing young women. There's actually a young woman who I've helped start up a digital marketing company. She's doing really well. She's getting clients and things like that. And I always kind of like try to bring closer all the women that I get in contact with, maybe because of the passion that I have for building brotherly and sisterly relationships in Christ, So I feel like the intimidation is there if you want it to be there. Perfect love casts out all fear. And I feel as though when we're thinking of all these intimidations and what could potentially or actually happen, we're not walking in love, But it is a thing that's out there. It is a thing in the church itself, in the sense that I know from previous experiences that there's women in the church that within the circle of men that I was in back in the days were just a no-go because they were considered to be women who were not going to submit to you, you know, not understanding that within that same chapter, it says submit, yes, husbands submit to your wives and wives submit to your husbands. It says both of us must submit, you know. But there was all this culture of no ways, bro. Don't go to that woman. She's got her own house, own car. She's successful, and she's gonna rule you. You know, it's a mindset that we grew up under. But I don't know, for some odd reason, I didn't internalize it. It's probably because of what I saw whilst I was growing up in my own home. But yeah, I mean, I feel it's something that's also needs to be addressed, but it's there. And from my side, no, I'm definitely not intimidated.
Sure. But maybe pivot, maybe to ask just one final question before we run out of time here. Just to ask you both, and just quickly, just to share your thoughts. What would it look like, do you think, for men to support and make room for women to be able to create and to pioneer? What do you think it would look like for that to happen? We've picked up on some things in the conversation so far, but what do you think it would look like for us to create that room?
Yeah, I think I'll go for it. Yeah, I think from my end, since we consider ourselves as the body of Christ, I think one of the things that we have to imagine ourselves in is reflecting collectively as men and women when it comes to the issues of our theology and the practical implications of it. So I think, and in that space, actually, from the voice of leadership, and I understand that as you mentioned, that depending on the background or the movement that you are associated with, you know, it can vary. But since we are just actually imagining it, oh geez, we don't have enough time. But since we are imagining in the same space, I think when it comes to the issues of how we have a voice when it comes to our interpretation of scripture, we need to do it collectively, because I've understood that when we reflect together, we're actually able to humble ourselves and create a platform in which we are able to learn together, as you do on your podcast. Is that I was listening to the way you were reflecting together on an issue, and yet as people who are coming from the same heart and with the same intention. So I think that for me is a good way to start when we reflect together in matters of scripture.
Ngabo, go for it. What are your thoughts?
Okay. No, I certainly agree. Like I said, is that there needs to be some sort of a unified body or an agreement, you know, a place where we know that when we agree about this, you know, we agree about these, like you're saying, a reflection, sorry, was saying, a reflection, and then from there, sort of like a unification, you know, where we unite under this one goal, which says, you know what, women have been overlooked for so much time, you know, let us then now begin to create a space for women to be, not just to say it, but like create projects and ministries, you know, which are focusing on this, you know, not just to do things because it's Women's Month, you know, to trend, and then when it's over, it's done, you know. So I come from a background of children's ministry. It's a ministry that gets forgotten totally as well, you know. So it's
sure, yeah, gentlemen. I think maybe we should wrap it up there and leave it there. I mean, there's obviously there's so many facets of this that we could continue to explore. So many aspects that we need to continue to learn and unlearn, and to pick up and to continue to grow. But again, like with most of the conversations that need to be had around unraveling past forms of oppression and ways of relating to one another that are ungodly and unjust, it's a process, and it's an ongoing thing of learning and seeing how other people are doing things, and picking up on what is good and what is right, and then running with it. But I think for now we can leave the conversation there at that point. And just open it up, I guess, for ongoing engagement online with this conversation that we've just had and with other conversations. And thanks very much for being a part of this conversation and for answering some of these questions, and for the many ways in which within your own spaces you are seeking to be dismantling these areas of oppression and these areas where we're not exactly walking necessarily in line with we're not necessarily keeping in step with the spirit. Where we need to continue to challenge ourselves and continue to challenge the people that are around us. So thank you again very much for the conversation. And yeah, it's been great. Thanks very much.